The Super Bowl is undeniably a modern spectacle in every aspect of the word, and in the 50-some odd years that it has existed, with each year that passes, the game continues to take on a life of its own, and it has evolved into an absolute behemoth of an event. No dime is spared in making it a completely over-the-top, grandiose production, but after all, that is what makes it the Super Bowl. At this point, it is so ingrained in North American culture that learning countless facts about the big game is basically a rite of passage here. That being said, 54 years is a long time, and the Super Bowl, just like football itself, is no stranger to controversy, strange decisions, and bizarre occurrences. So even if you think you know everything there is to know about the Super Bowl and its illustrious history, stick around through the end of the video. I bet you'll discover some interesting new tidbits about the big game. Like I mentioned before, a huge part of the Super Bowl's allure is the insane amount of money that gets poured into making it such an epic production. I mean, think about this. The trophy itself, which is just 22 inches long and 7 pounds, is made by Tiffany's & Co. That trophy cost around $25,000, and its manufacturing process is set to take upwards of 4 months. I guess that makes sense as it's made out of sterling silver, but come on, it's just a trophy. And if you thought that the cost of the trophy were mind-blowing, you won't believe the story behind how the trophy was designed. Out of the first Super Bowl, the NFL contacted Tiffany's & Co. to design a brand new trophy. The project ended up on the desk of the company's design chief, Oscar Riedner, a native of Switzerland who knew next to nothing about football. Oscar was stumped trying to figure out how in the world he was going to design a first-class trophy for a sport that he didn't know or care about for that matter. Seeking inspiration, he went out and purchased a football, which he set down on his kitchen table before going about the rest of the day. The next morning, he sat down at that same table and poured a bowl of cereal for breakfast, staring at the football, thinking about some potential designs for the trophy. As he stared at it, something caught his eye: the cereal box. He quickly grabbed a pair of scissors and started cutting a hole in the empty box, transforming it into a trophy base that the football could comfortably rest in. Later that week, he had lunch with Pete Rozelle, the NFL's commissioner, who had reached out to Tiffany's & Co. to design the trophy. Oscar took out a pen, grabbed a cocktail napkin, and sketched out the scene from his breakfast table, and Rozelle loved it. Yep, the Super Bowl trophy, one of the most iconic awards in all of sports, is just an adaptation of a football resting on a cutout cereal box. Pretty insane, especially considering how expensive it is. Speaking of how much money the NFL burns through for the Super Bowl each year, the same can be said for the fans that want to go watch the game in person. The demand for Super Bowl tickets is insane. Snagging a pair for the game requires a little more than just breaking open the old piggy bank. In fact, the average ticket cost for Super Bowl 54 is around $5,000. Quite exorbitant if you ask me, but you might be surprised to know that it wasn't always like this. Way back in 1967, when the first ever Super Bowl was played between the Green Bay Packers of the NFL and the Kansas City Chiefs of the AFL, ticket prices were much more modest. For Super Bowl I, you could get into the game for a little more than an order of Chipotle today. $12. What's even crazier is that folks back then even thought that was an offensive asking price, and as a result, the stadium had upwards of 30,000 empty seats for Super Bowl I. Obviously, the economic landscape of America was completely different back then, and buying tickets was not as simple a process as it is today. Fans couldn't just hop on their computers and purchase tickets like they do today. It was a pretty significant barrier for those who were already on the fence about trying to acquire tickets. It's interesting to note that the huge difference in ticket prices from the first Super Bowl to present day actually has more to do with demand for the tickets rather than the actual revenue that the league or the game itself is generating. Take a look at the difference in the Super Bowl bonuses between Super Bowl I compared to the numbers negotiated in the last CBA. For Super Bowl I, each player on the winning team took home a cool $15,000, while the losing team's players earned a $7,500 bonus check. Nowadays, the winning side receives a bonus of $124,000, and the losing side gets $65,000, and it goes up an additional $6,000 each year. So while the average ticket price is multiplied just over 416 times, the average Super Bowl bonus is a hair under 8.5 times the amount that was originally doled out. Of course, there are some other variables at play that have impacted how each number has changed, but regardless, that is a sizable gap. Anyways, it is still strange to think that the freaking Super Bowl was having trouble selling tickets. As it turns out, how the game was marketed played a huge role in the meager turnout. It wasn't just that they priced out a fair amount of the fans. They also made a costly decision to black out the game within a 75-mile radius of the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum in an effort to pressure the fans in the area to get to the stadium to watch. The decision incensed fans, and many of the ones who could afford to go protested the game as a result of the blackout. It was supposed to be a grand occasion. It was the first time that the two professional football leagues at the time, the American Football League and the National Football League, had ever played a joint championship game. But instead of ruckus, fanfare, and a roaring crowd, it was empty seats and outrage. I guess that was something they should have thought through a little bit more thoroughly during the 1966 merger negotiations, when the idea for a joint championship game was conceived. But like with many big-time mergers, there were plenty of hiccups early on. For starters, they had no idea how to sell the fans on the game. At the time, most football fans were staunchly AFL fans or NFL fans, and the NFL fans in particular were resistant to the idea of letting the upstart AFL cross over into the traditional league's championship. So maybe calling the game the AFL-NFL World Championship Game, as it was originally branded, was not the best idea. The name was clunky and hardly rolled off the tongue. During the negotiations, there were a handful of other ideas floated out there, like the Big One and the Pro Bowl. But then Commissioner Pete Rozelle stubbornly insisted on that god-awful name instead. Luckily for Rozelle and the rest of the league, Lamar Hunt, the owner of the Kansas City Chiefs, had a creative moniker that he referred to the game as, one that, much to the chagrin of Rozelle, the media ran with, the Super Bowl. Despite the fact that the media and fans took to the name, Rozelle was still resistant. He believed the word super was far too informal for his brand new title game, so the tickets read AFL-NFL World Championship Game for the first 3 years that the game was played, until he finally gave in to the court of public opinion and printed Super Bowl on the tickets for the fourth iteration of his prize championship game. There were still a ton of kinks to work out during the early years of the Super Bowl. They didn't even start tacking on the now iconic Roman numerals until Super Bowl V rolled around in 1972. This was again another idea from the Lamar Hunt brain trust. He thought that it would be too confusing to track the games by the numerical year, because the Super Bowl is played in a different year than when the NFL season starts. First 4 championship bouts have since been rebranded as Super Bowls, with the corresponding Roman numerals following, but it goes to show how much the entire operation and procedures around the Super Bowl have changed since it started. It wasn't just ticket troubles and terrible branding that plagued the Super Bowl early on. The two leagues have been operating disparately for some time, and there were a number of conflicts that came about trying to bring the two entities together. Let's start with a big one. Both the NFL and NFL had their own separate television deals. The NFL was partnered with CBS, while NBC had the rights to air AFL games. Of course, neither of the networks wanted to miss out on the opportunity to air its respective league's championship game, and thus ensued a too many cooks in the kitchen situation for the ages as they competed for ratings. And this was far from just some corporate war fought between two executive offices via advertising deals or strategic alignments. The tensions raged from top to bottom, even at the stadium. It got to the point that the stadium officials ended up building a fence in between the CBS and NBC production trucks to prevent any more altercations from taking place. The chaos ended up being unavoidable, and having two separate networks involved caused a whole slew of issues, including a big one following the halftime show. After the halftime intermission, the players and refs trotted back out on the field as they normally would. They got the go-ahead from the production crew, and the opening kickoff of the second half ensued. The only problem was they started to play after receiving the okay from just the CBS production crew. Meanwhile, the NBC broadcast was still in the midst of an interview with the famous comedian Bob Hope, preventing nearly half of the viewers at home from seeing the play. Fortunately, the game's operations team quickly realized the mistake, and in a split-second decision, they decided to redo the kickoff for the sake of the TV audience that missed it. Man, are they lucky that the second half kickoff didn't get returned for a touchdown or anything crazy like that. If you were curious, CBS ended up prevailing, outdrawing NBC by approximately 2 million viewers, which makes sense considering the NFL was a more popular product at the time. The networks weren't the only ones that found themselves in a combative situation as a result of the merger. There was also a big to-do made about which of the conflicting rules between the two leagues would be used for the game. For starters, during regular season AFL play, the teams used a different ball entirely. Unlike the NFL, who used the traditional Wilson pigskin, the AFL had a deal with Spalding, who had created them a slightly longer, more narrow ball. And if the variance in shape wasn't enough, the AFL ball also had a slightly different surface, which made it easier to grip. This was a huge issue leading up to the game and was hotly debated until they actually reached a compromise. So for the first Super Bowl, each team was permitted to use their league's ball on offense. There were, however, some differences that proved to be irreconcilable, like the AFL's 2-point conversion rule, which was barred from the game in favor of the traditional point-after-field goal attempt. This may come as a shock to some of today's younger fans, but the NFL actually continued to ban the 2-point conversion all the way up until 1994. Fortunately, as time went on and the AFL and NFL truly became one, most of these issues were smoothed out. Of course, it's impossible to get anything to run perfectly smoothly, even for an organization with as much financial backing as the NFL has. which is why there are still unexplainable mishaps like the electrical failure during Super Bowl 47 or the infamous Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson scandal during the early 2000s. I don't know about you, but I think the chaos adds to the fun of the whole event. Plus, it gives us no shortage of crazy facts to look at ahead of the Super Bowl each year. If you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to do so by clicking the subscribe button down below. If you like the video, then like the video, we'd really appreciate it. And last but not least, don't forget to tune in to TBS for more cool videos every single day. We'll see you next time.